Hello and welcome back to Parley. This one was paid for by Lordrusty. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about gaming and loneliness. August Parley, new employment situation means Lordrusty Parleys are so back. This month I want to ask about whether games are just a better medium for expressing loneliness than anything else. For context, I've started playing Hollow Knight in the last couple months, and it's crystallized for me something that I've known I liked about a bunch of games, but never been able to put a finger on. Some of my top games of all time really evoke a feeling of loneliness I don't experience in other media. Halo ODST, Rainworld, Venenith, Naissance, Subnautica, Zelda Twilight Princess. These all really capture a similar feeling to me. What's interesting is that most of these games actually have a lot of other character dialogue in them and can really explore how it feels for them to be a break in isolation and hear someone else's voice. Something about the fact that a game is an art medium where you're truly alone makes them stand out. While there are great movies about loneliness, Blade Runner 2049 is an example, while watching them you are still watching another human being on the screen, so even if you're watching by yourself, it's hard to feel lonely with someone else in front of your eyes. I think books are a little better at loneliness. You're still reading someone else's words and connecting with the writer, though. The only other medium which can come close for me is photography. I also wonder if this ability to explore loneliness through a medium we've never had before is linked to the uptake in interest in liminal spaces. Curious if this experience of gaming immersion enhancing this particular emotion is unique to me or somewhat universal. Cool. What an interesting topic. You linked a video about Naissance, and because I haven't played most of the games on your list, I decided to spend the first 10 minutes of preparing for this parlay watching the video. I still haven't played any of these games except for Zelda Twilight Princess, but I did watch that video, and I thought it was very helpful. I'm glad I chose to do that. So the first thing I want to establish as we go through some suggested thoughts about this subject, I have three of them. I first want to establish an idea that I think might help understand part of this subject that Lordrusty is interested in that wasn't immediately apparent to me, and that is what I'm going to call loneliness of ideology. Loneliness of ideology. The idea that purpose is gone from a space, and yet you're just kind of wandering the world with purpose in mind. Or possibly the purposes were not made for you, but you're still in the world. I know that this is a point where I can suddenly personally relate to this subject much more. I do think about loneliness a lot, but I don't think it's necessarily in I didn't think it was in a way where, openness in a game world would make me feel off. But there was an interesting line in the video. This one is just purely the person who made the video. So by the way, this is on Jacob Geller's channel. I wasn't familiar, but I'll link the video in this parlay because I thought it was good. It's not the style of video I normally enjoy, but I did think there was some excellent points, and I will be drawing on them, so they deserve credit for that. And so there was this line that he had in the video that I thought was really useful about how when you're alone in nature, there's this feeling of, he used the word solidarity that I thought was very enlightening. The nature didn't plan to be there either, right? I thought at first, as I was reading this parlay, well, I love being alone in a big space. I like that, it feels great. But as I thought about it more and thought about that line, I thought, well, but it's because I feel like everything isn't designed for what I usually get hung up on as kind of a silly or fallacious purpose. I'm in the nature, and we're all just here vibing, the trees and I. I don't know. And I think that makes me feel better. Often gives, again, I really like the idea of a feeling of solidarity. I hadn't quite thought of it that way before, but that is why I like that. Nice. By contrast, a lot of these games, Naissance is what the video is about, that game is about a clearly constructed space, and the idea presented in the video is that what's weird is that it's built, it's very intentionally made a way, or we perceive it that way. And so it creates a sense of discomfort that you don't get from being alone in a space like in nature, because you have a reassurance when you're in nature that there is no intent. You don't not understand the intent. The intent hasn't gone haywire, or you missed something or whatever, or it's not designed for you. Nature isn't designed for you, but it's not designed for anyone. I mean, and nothing, went wrong. That's just how it is. From your perspective, a built space that is kind of abandoned or doesn't fit you feels like it was designed for a reason, but something is off, or you don't belong there somehow. And that creates a sense of loneliness that comes from the fact that the ideology feels like a mismatch. Does that make sense? This seems to be important to Lordrusty to some extent, so I thought it was important to bring it up at the beginning of the parlay. Really interesting idea. I considered going on that for the entire time, but it seems like you want a bit of a broader shot. I just thought it was very important to start with that idea, and also that was really cool. So a second idea, and I think the first place where I'm going to propose that maybe, yes, video games are kind of better at loneliness than other pieces of media. You made a few points to introduce this point of mine. You made a few points that some people might quibble with a little bit, but I think have the right idea. So, for example, you mentioned how, video games are an art form where you can be truly alone. Well, a lot of the time, at first I thought, I don't really feel like that. But from first person perspectives, perhaps, yes, right? I think a lot of the time, when you have a third person perspective on a game, you're looking at a character that you are controlling, that's you. Personally, I feel like even when I feel immersed in that game, I still don't get the same experience as that character being me. It's almost like we're relay race partners a little bit. I would propose, what I'm saying is that even when people feel immersed in a third-person character, simply seeing another entity that you can identify as separate from you gives you a feeling that alleviates loneliness in a certain way. So even though technically it's like it's just you, I do think that mitigates a feeling of aloneness. To some extent. Again, we're assuming you are very immersed. That's not even to mention that people who aren't immersed are literally just looking at a character they don't think of as themselves. Sure. But in a first-person game, and then it doesn't mean there can't be characters. I liked that point you made. There might be characters there that contrast with when there aren't characters around, and so it feels lonely. Or the game just has essentially no characters, like Naissance appears to have more or less no other characters. Right, and so that's an interesting point that started me on this idea that video games have this weird strength to them where they can include elements that have no purpose in the world, but they're freed from the excuse of needing a purpose because they're game elements. They have a non-diegetic, non-in-the-world purpose as game elements. You see stairs in the video about Naissance, pop out of the wall, and you as a player think, yeah, so I can progress. There are stairs, so it's possible for me to progress. But in the world, why the heck are there stairs here? Why is any of this here? That there can be kind of no clear explained purpose because it is a fictional world that has the role of being a gameplay environment. That's really interesting. Things can be lonely feeling in this ideological way. They can have that loneliness of ideology in a way it's hard for them to in other media, because if it was a movie and stairs just appear, they're not there as a gameplay element. They feel like they're there as a convenience for the author. There's a way in which needing them for gameplay makes it feel like, oh, of course there are stairs here, because I need them or the game is unplayable. And even though that's kind of the same thing, I feel like it does feel different. It feels like that's kind of enough of an excuse. And then it adds to the ambiance, rather than you attacking the piece and saying, why is this there? It just kind of adds as an ambient detail, and you think, why are there so many things here that seem to serve no, like they were there so I could progress, but they weren't good for me to progress. It was just possible to progress, in the case of Naissance anyway. To put it a different way, if this sounds a little abstract, and I don't rely too much on that example I saw, Jacob Geller in that video uses the Mario games as another example, though not in this way. In a Mario platformer, a platform might be there, and there's no need for there to be like a diegetic in-world reason why the platform is there. it's there because it's a video game and it lets you progress. Like, it's a gameplay element, right? And that's a case where it's not being used to create ideological loneliness, but it's the same concept. You see what I mean? It's kind of freed from having a premise or like needing to have any excuse to exist because this is a video game in a way that it really wouldn't be in most other media. I suppose it's possible you could make a movie, let's say, about video games that had an element like that. An example that comes to mind for me is when you watch Tron, maybe. Being in the game world, or the computer world, I guess it is, there are details depicted in those worlds in that recent movie that might feel like an ideology of loneliness detail, but because it's framed as you being in a computer, you feel like you kind of know why, quote unquote, that detail is there. You see what I mean? And I think that when that happens, it kind of frees you from feeling like there's this feeling of isolation or loneliness because you have an explanation in the world of why that's there. But when the thing is directly a video game, yeah, you know, it kind of it almost feels like it just needs to be there. It doesn't have to be there, and then you're left wondering, well, there's a story to this world, or why was this made this way? At the very least, you're left with maybe the good version of the death of the author concept, where you think, well, the game creator put this here so I could progress, but why did they make it hard to use to progress? They're trying to say something, and yet you're left with no explicit reason why that is. That feeling of like being ideologically isolated, maybe it's a better way to say, I think is pretty important. One of the most interesting things I've gotten to while thinking about this parlay. So I wanted to bring that up as an initial point. I think that one way in which video games are better at serving up loneliness is this feeling like they can include details that kind of have an excuse to exist, which allows them to feel eerily purposeless in their own world in a way that's difficult in other media. Even if you depict a video game in other media, it almost doesn't work the same way because it feels like, you know, that seemingly random purposeless detail is there so it feels like a video game or something like that. Which kind of frees it from feeling eerie or purposeless, even though the purpose is the same as if it was in a video game. Does that make sense? Is that too weird? I hope that makes sense. So on that point, I would say yes. I think that's a good point. I didn't think of it that way before, but yeah. And I do find myself among the most interested in world building in video games, which I think is another way to think about this. I think that a part of the feeling of loneliness is curiosity, or a yearning to discover meaning, or just something to alleviate the loneliness. And that feeling of curiosity being spurred on or wanting an explanation because it feels kind of uncomfortable otherwise, sometimes, is provoked by video games in a way it isn't in other media. As a side note, I don't have too much to offer about, but I just think it's interesting. You could also say that another way in which the game mechanics help provoke this feeling is that you often need an explanation to progress in the game. Like, you need to understand the world so you can progress, which gives you sort of an excuse or kind of forces you to be uncomfortable in the world. Even if you normally wouldn't have had this sort of loneliness of ideology, to play the game, you often literally have to have that feeling a little bit so that you're looking around for purpose. So it sort of urges you to do that in a way that other media don't. Literally, this simple act of playing and needing to operate the game or it doesn't move forward forces you to sort of search for purpose and feel weirdly lonely in a way that obviously a movie doesn't. And it's interesting to look at your example of reading a book. Like, the book is linear, and so if you read through the book and the book is reasonably well written and you're trying as a reader, you'll probably find whatever purpose or amount of that feeling the author was, going for. But at the same time, you do need to take action to find that purpose. When something feels purposeless in a story, generally it's a movie or a show, you can sit there and the purpose will be presented to you. You see what I mean? So in that sense, I think, yes, like, video games are strong at providing that feeling, but framing it only as loneliness by itself might not be enough to convince some people. So I hope this way of thinking of it was felt like a more solid description. It certainly sold me. That's really cool. I have a counterpoint, though. This isn't really a point about video games being bad at portraying loneliness. I'm not particularly interested, as you might guess by knowing me a little bit, that in arguing which mediums are like the best at portraying loneliness. But one note about video games portraying loneliness that I think is interesting is that video games are, in my notes, I have this written as are games better at everything, but just harder to do well. And so the only ones we've played like are good at depicting whatever they're depicting, but there's not very many good examples of that thing. Or to put it another way, Lordrusty was able to give a lot of examples, but I wonder how many good examples there are. And so, in fact, it's just that the strongest examples in video games are very, very strong. You could put it yet another way. You know, a movie or an anime or a TV show has a lot of different elements to its production. So it's a very powerful tool to depict a feeling or to demonstrate something in a way that maybe books, for example, aren't to as many people, or photography is maybe asking more from the audience in some ways. I think it is. And so when these things tackle these subjects, they do so to great effect, but it is much harder to make a thing that tackles those subjects because there are just more elements involved. I don't necessarily think that just because a video game involves more elements, that means it's harder to make than a good photograph, even though you can make a photograph much more easily than you can make a video game, I would argue. That doesn't mean you can make a good photograph more easily than making a good video game. But if we consider the artistic depiction to be the same difficulty, whatever that means, like depicting loneliness effectively has the same, time or mental cost, then taking the photograph is maybe a bit more of an immediate way if you get to a moment where you can take a photograph that depicts loneliness. Whereas the video game requires you to kind of sit and, mechanically make the video game, construct the video game, which adds a certain layer. This is something I think about a lot. I feel like a lot of my initial pass on this subject is that video games and movies, which take a ton of mechanical time to create, I wonder that time doesn't smooth off the edges of a lot of the thing's ideas. And so you get a lot of things that are very polished and don't have too raw of a creative vision. Whereas photography is a medium where you would see, and like painting, for example, not just photography, these are mediums where you're going to see a lot of more untumbled ideas, raw ideas. Maybe. I don't know. On the other hand, emotional ideas in work are very strong, and so video games, the few video games that have retained that throughout that process are going to be high performers. You see what I mean? It's not like there are no video games that are emotional. It doesn't shine off all the emotion. But I do think the process inherently challenges that feeling. What I'm trying to say is that if you were to find a video game that depicted loneliness, I feel like by this sort of process of natural selection or elimination by which that video game came to be, you would expect the ones remaining that retained that feeling of loneliness to be very strong at it. Does that make sense? And so I'm wondering if that selection process, or whatever you want to call it, which I hope kind of makes sense, there's a lot of ideas in this one, would result in the few examples we have of video games depicting loneliness being extremely powerful examples of that feeling. But if you were to look at the medium as a whole, it isn't particularly good at giving you a depiction of loneliness. You see what I mean? This would be an argument that video games like display very strong depictions of loneliness, but it isn't particularly a strong choice were you to want to depict loneliness. It's just that if you manage to get through depicting loneliness in a video game, it's probably going to be pretty good, sort of by necessity. Does that make sense? Kind of a pedantic argument, but I think it's still an interesting point. I think it's true that a lot of video games are not going for an art type of appeal. They're not trying to be good in an artistic way, simply because they can be good in more ways than other media. They can be just fun, for example. You could argue that is artful. But what I mean is you could focus on gameplay elements and not emotional weight or a philosophical prodding idea, or bringing some thoughts out in the player. You can focus on it being engaging as a game, or hard, for example, in a way that you kind of can't make other types of art hard, if that makes sense. You maybe could, but I think you get what I mean. And so video games will simply have a wider range of goals, I would argue. Whereas maybe you would say, out of any painting you've ever seen, the number of possible goals that painting had is maybe a little bit smaller of a range than the number of possible goals for a video game. I think that's an argument you could make that I'm making, sure. I could think of some counterpoints, but go figure. Let's tackle this from a different perspective now. Maybe it's just Lordrusty, though. You said at the end, curious if this experience of gaming immersion enhancing this particular emotion is unique to me or somewhat universal. Well, I've provided quite a few reasons why it probably isn't unique. I mean, it's almost certainly not unique to you, right? But maybe to some extent it also is. I also think it's worth thinking about the experience of playing a video game. So moving beyond what's on the screen to you are playing a video game, if that makes sense. Some of these things are painfully obvious to begin with, but just go with me for a sec. I do think it's meaningful to attack it from this perspective, and I bet some of you have been impatiently thinking this the whole time. You are maybe literally more likely to be physically alone when playing the video game, right? The video game is a single player game, so compared to the movie, which it does really nothing to affect the movie if you watch it with other people, you are likely playing the single player game at least, alone in focus. Maybe there are people around, but there's a very good chance they're not. I don't know about you, but many of the times I choose to play single player video games are when I am the most alone already, right? Again, kind of obvious when you put it that way, but I do think that's meaningful. Video games are a type of leisure activity then that gets you in a vulnerable point. And so that's another way where you could say, while video games out of context might not be particularly good at depicting loneliness, it's a good time to depict loneliness when you're playing a video game. You see what I mean? I hope that feels like a more meaningful point than you're literally obviously all alone when you play video games a lot of the time. Like, no duh. But there's other things too, of course. You can choose a multiplayer game. There's sort of a choice to be alone when you play a game that is not a game you play with other people. If you have other people to play the game with, there's a higher percentage that you chose to do something that requires that you do it by yourself. You chose to play this single player game instead of something else. Now, this is a little artificial. This is not scripted, but great timing. Right now, like it's during my workday. My partner and I both work from home, and we play video games together all the time, but I also, obviously, play a lot of games for work and just for fun, and something that is in between very often, that are single player, right, that are not things my partner and I play. My partner has a pretty flexible work schedule like me. I can, in the abstract, at basically any time play a game with my partner. There really is no, like, I can't choose to play a game with someone else. That probably less than almost every other human being alive happens to me very rarely. I can nearly always choose to play a game with someone else. I mean, if she wants to play the game, of course. And so when I don't choose, for me, that is an unusually meaningful choice. Maybe I'm speaking from my own perspective, but that's my premise for this section. To some extent, maybe Lordrusty is in a surprisingly similar context. I have no idea. But it's quite possible that this would be drawn up for someone like that. For other people, choosing to play a video game alone, some of you might be thinking, it's not a choice at all. I just don't have friends. People meme about that. It's YouTube, so if I say you have friends, some of you are going to say that in the comments. Some of you don't have people you're playing games with. Nothing wrong with that. It took me a while to get into a good place in my life like that. or your friends aren't free nearly as flexibly as you are. Like they just have different hours, right? For almost everybody alive, it's less of a choice than it is for me. And for a lot of people, I think that means it doesn't really feel like a choice, which would make this feel much less relevant to those people. It's possible that Lordrusty, you are just in a position similar to mine in some way, where this is a much more relevant part of the equation to you. Video games are a choice toward loneliness in a way that they maybe aren't for other people, possibly. I know that is true for me. And sometimes that keeps me from playing games. I think I don't really want to do something where I isolate myself in the same way. And so when I play the game, there's a feeling of often positive solitude. I've kind of done this thing on my own. I think a very positive aspect, which isn't what this parlay's about, but go figure, is that I often feel like I've gained some sort of feeling of independence. Like I get reassured that I do have fun by myself. This is a point that I think is quite strong for me, but other people may not feel the same way. And so, yeah, playing a game by yourself, making builds in particular by yourself, I often think, yeah, I could just do this for weeks and I would be having fun. I am perfectly fine on my own. And in the first place, it's questionable whether you should be fine on your own as a human being. But anyway, my point is that that might be another element. What else do I have to say? So yeah, I think to some extent you can see there are points where video games are quite strong at depicting loneliness, especially the loneliness of ideology that I described at the beginning. You can imagine places where video games have perhaps a selection process that removes all but the strongest depictions of loneliness, and so that's why they appear to be quite good at depicting it, though it isn't a particularly, and I said good before, but I really mean easy way to depict loneliness. It's just that if you make it in a video game, you know, that might be quite strong. I do think to add a little point to that, the simple act of forcing the player to physically operate the game makes video games a very potent ability tool to demonstrate an emotion. Like forcing the player to act through, like putting someone in a play and trying to get an emotion across that way, making the player literally do it is obviously a fairly potent way to make them feel something. You literally force them to do it themselves. That's clearly quite strong. But maybe it's difficult to get the raw emotions you're feeling as an artist through when you have to perform a lot of minutia to construct the piece of art. It's not as immediate to express yourself as something like taking a photograph or making a painting or writing a poem, as an example I didn't give before. And then finally, there's a consideration that it may be just Lordrusty to some extent, though those points still stand. I can definitely relate to that myself. This was an awesome one. What an interesting subject to bring up. In particular, I'm left with a feeling like I've often brought this up when making builds, the idea that for a lot of people, not having time to construct a build precludes their interest in the genre. Like people don't know whether they enjoy making builds because they simply haven't. Like they just don't have time to do. When I say I like that, they don't have time to do the thing I'm saying I like. And so it's that's not really their fault. They can't just choose to have time to do that. And so that also is a subject I constantly think about when I make builds. I think, what is this thing I'm doing? You know, I sat here for 4 hours having analysis paralysis about my Limbus company team or whatever. What is my life? What am I doing with myself? And yet I feel that felt fine to me. But there was a feeling of making this project all by yourself, or sort of instituting this goal all on your own, that to me feels tangentially related and is what I will be thinking about after this parlay. A related subject is that a lot of players have bounced off games like Warframe because they really ask the player to make their own goals, some people feel. But when I played Warframe, I didn't feel like that. Not because it isn't true, but simply because I find that so normal. That's been so normalized to me. I'm just so lonely, but that's not really what I mean, that it didn't really bother me. So I don't know, I think that the personal perspective part of this is meaningful. But overall, I think, yes, there are reasons why video games are good at depicting that feeling. I didn't have any comments on liminal spaces. being a factor. You mentioned that, and I didn't have anything to say. Liminal spaces, like the spaces between. So I'd be interested to explore that further, but I didn't have anything to say about it now. So I hope it was okay that I didn't shoehorn that in. Thank you very much for asking. Hope you enjoyed it.